So Duelist Cup is almost here, and I figured a good way to prep for the Duelist Cup is to go over in some more detail the most played decks so far in the ladder, which I think would roughly translate to the decks that you will expect to face the most during the Duelist Cup. And to determine the most played decks, I'm going to be using data from Untapped GG and looking at all the games from Diamond and Master Rank to determine the most played decks. And we're still early enough in the season to where even the more hardcore players are still would have played a large portion of their games in Diamond Rank, just because we're still only pretty early into the month still. But yeah, let's get on to the first deck. So as an aside, I want to mention that the specific deck list I'm showing you right now are what I just think are extremely standard builds of these decks. So I'm not going to spend too much time going over the specific card for card choices in these builds. And if you want a more detailed breakdown of the card choices, then I recommend looking at the deck lists on Tap GG and on Master Duel Meta. But yeah, first of all, the 5th most played deck so far on the ladder this season is Yubel. And Yubel, it's a deck that if you've been playing for the past few months, you're probably very familiar with this. The idea is that even though it has 2 Phantom Yubel now, and it had 2 Opening the Spirit Gates and 2 Big Dark Banking Beast as hits from like 2 balance to go, this deck is largely do what it's always done, which is try to make the strongest board in the entire game off of just 1 or 2 cards. It's not uncommon at all for Yubel to be able to end on an Appaloosa, Phantom of Yubel, Unchained Soul of Rage with an escape set, and then even with some 2-card combos, you could have an elf on top of that, which is just ridiculous because that gives your Appaloosa targeting protection. Holding an imperm, for the Appaloosa no longer works if they weave elf into the combo. It gives your Unchained Soul of Rage targeting protection. It also gives your Unchained Soul of Rage callback protection. Sometimes you want to use the escape of the Unchained early to pop your Soul of Rage, to pop your opponent's card, and then usually you would try to call by the Soul of Rage so it wouldn't come back, right? But now with Elf on the field, if you control any monster, you can't even call by the Soul of Rage in that situation because the Elf will just simply revive the Soul of Rage because it's a link to and you control a monster and then effectively dodge the call by. So yeah, if you let Yubel make its full end board, except under like very rare circumstances, you're probably not going to win that game. And another thing about Yubel is that going second, it always has a chance going second, right? This deck doesn't get stonewalled by any one particular monster, right? Sometimes the other decks that I'll bring up, they might face problematic monsters. Tenpai, which surprise Tenpai is one of the 5 most played decks. No spoilers there. An unaffected Terahertz can end the Tenpai's day. A Borderland Dragon is sometimes hard for a lot of decks to out. A Light and Dark Chaos Angel, which this deck, funny enough, this deck can make a Light and Dark Chaos Angel using Phantom Yubel plus Effect Veiler, but usually this is the deck that's going to make an unaffected Chaos Angel. But for other decks that do, Chaos Angel could be an issue. There's no single problematic monster that Yubel fears because their win condition going second is not to clear your board. It's simply to ram 2 to 3 Yubel monsters into your monster with a Nightmare Pain up, and then simply just burn you for game that way. So, yeah, this deck is there always has a chance to win going second. It never feels out of it. You have to be careful. Even like if you play against Voiceless Voice, for example. Well, Voiceless Voice feels slick with their 4100 attack Skull Guardian out, but when you're playing against Yubel, well, suddenly you're now in danger of losing to 2 Yubel crashes into your massive Skull Guardian. So, yeah, there's that advantage when even going second. And then another thing about Yubel is that for the Tenpai matchup, which again we're going to be referencing Tenpai a lot because it is going to be one of the most played decks, Phantom of Yubel gets around cards like Sangan Summoning, right? So, well, what the hell did I just type right there? Yeah, Sangan Summoning, in case you didn't know, makes your 5 dragon monsters unaffected by opponent's effects. Well, Phantom Yubel doesn't care about that because Phantom Yubel is not affecting the monster. It's affecting the effect of the monster. So technically, cards like Sangan, cards and other cards that are unaffected by other card effects like other towers, Phantom Yubel goes right through them, and it still quote unquote negates them. Although it doesn't technically negate them. That's why it works. It just turns their monster effects into destroy a Yubel monster from your deck and get a free Yubel body on your field. So a negate plus benefits deck always works and goes through towers like effects. So yeah, that's very fair. That's why, you know, Yubel is still like such a scary deck. It's strong end boards, and Phantom Yubel being the completely custom card. But this deck does have some weaknesses as well. One of the things about its end board is that if this deck is gonna lose after it made its full end board, it's gonna lose because your opponent drew multiple board breakers. So specifically in a 10-by matchup, this can be awkward because if your opponent is on multiple different board breakers such as Lightning Storm, Dark Hole, and Raigeki, any two will pretty much completely wipe your board. Since you put up a field full of monster negates and full of floating monsters, but you have no spell and trap negates, and none of your monsters are protected from destruction. So 2 Dark Holes, 2 Raigekis, Lightning Storm plus Raigeki, they will often just clear your board completely. And then that's a massive problem. There are some Yubel decks that, in order to mitigate their weakness to board breakers, that they've been playing Scythe as well in their deck as just a way to where if you get board breaker too much, you know, if you get Dark Hold on like your Unchained Soul Rage, at the very least, you can trigger the Yama Engrave to summon back the Rage and then pop the Scythe, and then Scythe lock your opponent after you get board wiped. So yeah, that's a way that Yubel has been playing around this board breaker weakness, although granted, Scythe is not exactly the good card to draw or anything. It takes another extra slot in the extra deck. The Scythe combos aren't guaranteed either. You have to already be comboing pretty well in order to get the Scythe. And obviously, against other decks that aren't playing board breakers, Scythe is largely unnecessary. But yeah, this deck has been seeing a non-zero amount of play in Yubel, especially since 10-by has been introduced into the game. Another weakness of Yubel is that, and unfortunately, it's gotten specifically a lot more weaker to Max C given the ban list, because the ban list limited to Gamma, and a lot of times Yubel could catch the opponent off guard by first action summoning a Phantom of Yubel, which already checks potential Max C. But now, without the threat of Gamma to punish Maxis on a clear board, a lot of people are dropping Maxi earlier now. They're just dropping Maxi in the draw phase, already to just play around something like Tactics, for example. But by doing draw phase Maxi, you also can't catch your opponent off guard with a Phantom of Yubel to negate the Maxi anymore. And they're doing that because there's basically almost no threat of Gamma anymore. There's very few decks that are even considering running the 1-of Gamma anymore. So yeah, and obviously this deck is one of those decks that's super weak to Maxi. You know, you can't really make up especially without Ibli Lock. You know, there's no auto win end board you can make within a good number of summons. You probably give your opponent 2 to 3 draws just to end on like something like a Rage, for example, which is not ideal. And well, I mentioned that Yubel always has a consistent game plan for going second. This deck isn't the best deck at going second. You know, sometimes you will draw hands that are actually very, very vulnerable. For example, if you straight up open Dark Magnet Beast or Period Rice map as like your only starters and you don't have something like an opening to Spirit Gates, getting your normal summon negated is a big deal. It can oftentimes end your turn. And even if you do open something like a Spirit Gates or a Nightmare Throne, for example, if your opponent has something as simple as an IP Masquerade to link off into an SP, which is a very, very common form of interruption in Master Duel, and then get your normal summon, like your Breathmaking Beast or Sandstar Duelist banished, that's also massive, because then the Spirit Gates you cannot use to reborn your monster because it's not in the graveyard. So then you have very few ways to play. You have to like minus Jubel monsters from your hand to make a Phantom in order to get an extra body, and that's never feels nice. Minusing like 2 cards from your hand to just summon a body on the board that you're just going to link off into an established board, right? So yeah, this deck, it has room for hand traps, but it doesn't have room for the most hand traps either. You know, 13 hand traps in the 40 card deck in this build, for example. Some people go lower than 13, and like honestly 13 and 12-ish hand traps is average at best in 2024 standards for the amount of hand traps this deck can run. So yeah, they're basically Yubel, very strong deck at going first, makes very strong end boards, very stupid cards like Phantom Duel, sometimes a little weak to board breakers because of lack of spell negates, you know, weakness to Max E, but that's like not specific to Yubel. That's like a weakness that many decks will share with Yubel, and yeah, sometimes it's vulnerable going second. So what are decks that are good against Yubel? Well, first of all, board breaker decks that run board breakers, specifically Tenpai. You know, if Tenpai, again, if it runs multiple monster removals like Dark Hole, Lightning Storm, Raigeki, as long as you don't get scythed, you know, you'll have a better chance than any other deck at breaking Yubel's board. And also, another thing about Yubel's end board is that I'll get a lot of monster negates, but not a lot of ways to interact with spell and traps, obviously. So if you're playing a heavy back row deck, like for example some of the trap labyrinth builds, the decks that run 20, 30 plus trap cards and just aim to set 5, Yubel's end board doesn't actually interact that well with you. And your hand traps, those decks generally do not care as much about hand traps. So heavy back row decks, you can just set 5 and play a slow game and eventually grind you out, even if you do make your full board as Yubel. So yeah, those are that's Yubel in a nutshell. Let's move on to the next one. Next, we have the 4th most played deck this season, which may be surprising to some people, but it's actually Labyrinth. And this is a furniture build, and there is another way that people have been playing Labyrinth, and that's with, you know, a more heavy trap lineup build, which is like playing close to 30 traps, taking out all the hand traps, all the furnitures, and running stuff like Lord of the Heavenly Prison and Solemns in its place. And while that is definitely a valid way to play it, I think that the data shows that Furniture Labyrinth is the more common way to play Labyrinth right now, and it is also how Labyrinth got top 10 in the rating duels last season, although admittedly that was with a different card pool, because now we have simultaneous equation cannon, which is one of the most ridiculous cards in the game. I'm not going to go into super detail on how to use this card, because the math is like that could require an entire whole video by itself, which I will link you the videos that do discuss the math behind simultaneous equation cannon and how to use this properly. But basically, for all intents and purposes, this card is just the strongest card in the entire game if you build your extra deck to build your extra deck around this card, which it's definitely worth building, because if you resolve this card, again, you banish your opponent's entire field. Every one of your cards is gone. You resolve this once, you should win the game off of this. That's how powerful of a card this is. So yeah, it's very this card coming into Master Duel as not even in the secret pack, but as like a fucking legacy pack card, is a huge buff for Labyrinth. And yeah, speaking of the upsides with Labyrinth, so a benefit of playing Labyrinth is that in a format where there's just tons of hand traps flying around, and the most played deck, or one of the most played decks in this format, is just playing so many hand traps, like 18 plus hand traps regularly. It's nice to play a deck that does not really care about hand traps as much as the average combo deck or even mid-range deck, for example. You know, like Max C, this deck kind of just laughs with Max C. You rarely give your opponent a plus off of Max C. Stuff like Imperm is like, whatever, you're gonna Imperm me, okay, I'm gonna set 2 to 3 or 4 cards even anyways, whatever, and you can even dodge Imperm with stuff like Big Welcome Labyrinth. Really, the only hand trap that this deck typically cares about, and only non-engine for that matter, is stuff like Ash Blossom and Bell, which Bell is a lot less common, so like Ash is really the main thing you have to worry about. But most other hand traps, Labyrinth just does not really not care about at all compared to most other decks, especially compared to the other most played decks that appear in this video. And also this deck, you know, this deck has an infinite grind. So like if you get into a grind game with this deck and you get into game state where Lovely is resetting back a trap every turn, and then Lady Labyrinth is setting a new trap from your deck every turn, and there's Field Spell up, and there's Welcomes in the grave, you're never going to win in a prolonged game with Labyrinth. If the game goes on for like 3 or plus more turns, and you yourself are not playing Labyrinth, then the Labyrinth deck is gonna just steamroll you. The Labyrinth deck is gonna win the grind game basically every time. And you know, speaking of the trap cards you can set, the trap cards are a reason why this deck farms Tenpai. Tenpai being the most played deck in the entire game. That should be no surprise to people. And this deck, Labyrinth, has one of the best matchups to it, because again, you don't care about the hand trap as much as the other decks. And look at the trap cards you can set. Dimensional Barrier, auto turn skip versus Tenpai. Simultaneous Equation Cannon, obviously auto turn skip against Tenpai. You know, you can't hand trap Deep Barrier, you can't hand trap Simultaneous Equation Cannon, right? And then for the builds that are playing the Solemns, then that's even more, it's even more in their favor, because then not even the blowouts, which are the only chances that Tenpai ever has a chance of beating you, is by resolving a blowout back row card, like a Lightning Storm or a Heavy Storm or a Duster, which they cannot do versus the trap heavy builds that play these Solemns and Lord of Heavenly Prisons. But even against the normal trap Labyrinth deck, right? Like, even if you resolve a back row wipe, for example, obviously ignoring the anti-spell fragment, because if you open anti-spell, it's also game over for Tenpai. But yeah, if you like Feather Duster me, but I have a Dimensional Barrier set, that also doesn't do you any good, because it just skips your turn anyway. So then, even when you wipe the back row, all the back row is recurable in Labyrinth. So it goes back to me, and then you can just re-establish all your trap cards again. So yeah, lots of advantages for Labyrinth in this format. Now, the disadvantage is that while this deck is very strong going first, and obviously it farms the deck that makes you go first all the time, this deck is Labyrinth is a bit weaker going second, just because you're running all of these back row, but you're not running as many hand traps as an average deck, right? Even in Furniture Labyrinth, you have like 3 Maxi, 3 Ash, and then you can... Some builds run Imperm, although not every build runs Imperm now, especially with the introduction of Simultaneous Equation Cannons. And Aria's is like half a trap, or half a hand trap, so that's like potentially up to 9 to 12 hand traps at most, which is honestly below average by 2024 standards. And obviously if you're playing the trap heavy Labyrinth build, then you run no hand traps. So yeah, there's a lot of unfair decks in this format. There's multiple FTKs. There's a bunch of decks that put up multiple negates. Maybe not the most played decks, but a lot of the greedier combo decks that maybe aren't the most played, but are like the Pendulum builds, the ones with Draco Slayer that search Secret Village, the Melodious Supreme King that end on multiple, that end on like a Baron, Vortex Rack, and multiple Omni negates. You're gonna have a rough time going second against the very, very high end and high ceiling combo decks. So yeah, that's an issue. And then obviously Dimension Barrier, while it's very good against decks where it's good against, that's a shocking statement, I know, but link-based decks, there are a few link-based decks that maybe do not care as much about Dimension Barrier because it doesn't hit link decks. And I'll get to those decks later that have a good matchup against Labyrinth, and also your other trap cards like Destructive Daruma Cannon against certain fusion-based decks. Again, I'll get to what decks have a decent matchup against Labyrinth. The Daruma Cannon does not fully stop a fusion deck like it stops a lot of other decks. Yeah, we'll get to those later. And then obviously the last thing is this is vulnerable to back row removal. Obviously it's a back row deck, so like again, when Tenpai is running Duster and Heavy Storms and Lightning Storms, and possibly even Red Reboot. Mind you, Red Reboot is the big killer because it turns off everything you have for the entire turn. If you get hit by one of those in an untimely fashion, then the game can just end right there. So that's just the unfortunate downside of playing a back row deck in format where all of these board wipes are legal. It's a risk you have to take, but if you can avoid getting absolutely blown out by them, then then this deck is fairly well positioned. So the decks that have a particularly good matchup against Lab, obviously there are those greedy and high ceiling combo decks when they go first, obviously, but there's one certain link-based deck that has just an overwhelming matchup versus Labyrinth, and that's Fire King Snake Eyes. That's probably the worst matchup in the entire game for Labyrinth, and the fact that Dimension Barrier does nothing to that matchup hurts. The fact that sometimes a badly timed Rumor Cannon also doesn't even do it because of Zealantis being able to reflip Fire King's monsters face up. So yeah, it's a bad matchup for Labyrinth, and when Fire King's Snake Eyes was like the dominant deck, you know, there's a reason why Lab usage like plummeted, because you know, who wants to play that matchup, right? And then also the fusion based decks, stuff like Tier and Branded, it can be weird. I know D-Barrier is a card, and if you ever get D-Barrier in control, if you ever get in a position where you can recycle D-Barriers and you can control the game with D-Barrier, then it's pretty much over for Tier and Branded. But if you don't get access to D-Barrier, then the matchups are actually kind of rough, the fusion-based ones, because your Darumas honestly don't really do much in those matchups, and then Tier and Branded will they actually honestly just outvalue your monsters, not to mention Branded in particular completely gets rid of your big monsters with Mirror Jade, like Lovely Labyrinth and Lady Labyrinth, so be careful of that. Also, They tend to, Tier and Brandon tend to run less hand traps, and if they do run non-engine, they're more likely to run board breakers and stuff like Super Poly, and Super Poly does way more, hurts your deck way more than typical hand traps do. So yeah, and then obviously Voiceless Voice can also be a weird matchup. Again, it comes down to D-Barrier. If you can D-Barrier Voiceless Voice for Ritual every turn, it's over, but if you don't, then Voiceless Voice gets an Omni Negate every turn, and that's really hard for a trap-based deck to deal with. Yeah, that's Labyrinth in a nutshell. I guess I'll briefly go over the extra deck requirements. So like, there's 3 flex slots: Chaos Angel, Muckraker, and Typhon. Besides these 3 is like the most amount of flex slots I'd recommend, and everything else, at minimum 12 of the rest of your extra deck slots should be dedicated to resolving simultaneous equation cannon. So here we have a level 1 fusion, a level 2 fusion, a level 3 fusion, level 4 fusion, level 5 fusion, level 6 fusion. At minimum, you should have fusions from levels 1 through 6, and you should have 2 rank 3s, 2 rank 4s, 2 rank 5s, and 2 rank 5s to make the simultaneous equation math work out better for you. But yeah, let's go on to the next one. So the third most played deck this season, and this will also shock some people, it's Fire King Snake Eyes. That's right, this deck is officially back. I know that after the ban list that put Poplar to 1 and then Kieran to 2, this deck took a little bit of a backseat in terms of usage, and you saw it actually fall out of the top 5 most played decks for a month or two. Now that we're back into a Duelist Cup month, this deck has been surging back in popularity. And, you know, for good reason. First of all, it shows that the ban list hits did not hurt this deck, you know, nearly enough or nearly as much as a lot of people that wanted this deck to die kind of predicted. No, this deck is in fact still super playable. And the reasons why people are picking this deck back up again are: 1, its end board is actually very well positioned against Tenpai. It has a very layered end board. Oftentimes, you're going to have combinations of an Appaloosa that was made of IP Masquerena, which is very important, an Ambler Whale, a Fire King Island with a Sanctuary on board, and then in your grave, on board, you're going to have like a Flambird sometimes with an that summons back an IP. In your grave, you have a Promethean Princess, and you also have the Ambler Whale, which when it's also in the grave, it also pops another card if another one of your Link 2 or Link 3 or lower monsters gets popped. There's 7+ interruptions in this end board, and they're all at different. Can be used at different intervals, and they're all at different locations. You know, some interruptions are in your hand, like your hand traps or like your Kieran. Some interruptions are on the field. Some interruptions are in your grave. It's really, even though this deck does not make a single spell and trap negate, it's extremely hard to board break this. Unlike the U-Bell board, for example, where the U-Bell board has all of its interactions pretty much on the field. Yeah, if you try dark holing or try getting a Fire King Snake Eyes board, see what happens after, right? And also, you know, the Appaloosa, crucially being made of IP, means that it's also immune to those types of monster destructions. Your Fire King Island cannot get blown up easily because you have a Sanctuary on the field, and the Sanctuary will protect the Fire King Island. Again, if your opponent tries to droplet you, what are they dropliting? Are they dropliting your Appaloosa? And then later on in the turn, they're opening themselves to getting hit by the Promethean Princess in the grave. If they wait until you summon back the Ivy Masquerena, they're going to eat a bunch of Appaloosa negates first before getting the value off droplets. And again, you always have the option of, well, Sanctuary is up on the field. You can go into, you threaten Garunix Eternity, which is also another board wipe, like a field nuke on your opponent's turn. So yeah, it's just, Tenpai, it finds itself really hard to try to break through this board. And obviously, if Tenpai struggles to break through your Fire King Snake Eyes board, then this is also, it also means that the board is pretty strong, like against most decks too. And also, speaking of the Tenpai matchup, right? Specifically the Tenpai matchup is so good for this deck is because even if you get Max Seed, this is one of those decks where if you get Max Seed, you can make a Fusho. And if you haven't read this card, you should get used to reading this card, because this card cannot be destroyed in battle, and it's unaffected by your opponent's. It's unaffected by other card effects. So Tenpai cannot OTK you. Even if you get Max Seed, if you get Shifter, you just make a Fusho, and you guarantee live until the next turn. And then you get to turn 3, and then you get to play again. So yeah, this is one of the best decks at beating Tenpai in the meta. And also, this is one of the few decks that's engine is, I would say, considered decently strong at playing through end boards. Now I'm not gonna say that you can break full boards with just engine, but you don't have to rely on hand trapping your opponent completely and stopping them so that they end on nothing. If you even like hand trap them once and they end on like a half board, you can easily play through most half boards in the game, and you can honestly even play through some full boards with your engine, because you have tons of extenders still. You still have the Die Bellstars and the Wanted. You have Bonfires, which did not get hit on the balance, so it's still at 2. You have access to stuff like 1-for-1. Kieran, while it's at 2, you're seeing it less. It's still very good at playing through disruption. It's very good at dodging. It's very good at dodging stuff like in target negation, like Imperm and Effect Veiler. And also, it's just a ridiculous draw to pop with Sanctuary and Island, because then it summons back a body and it pops a card. So yeah, and obviously you have all the dumb fire tools. You have access to all the dumb fire tools that we all know and love, like Promethean Princess, Yolanda's OTKing out of literally just having 2 bodies. Like, literally just having 3 bodies plus a Hida already gets you there. So, yeah, very good at going second. And another thing is that this deck has no bad matchups. Unlike the other decks featured in the top 5, I would say there's no deck that Fire King Snake Eyes really goes like worse than 50-50 against, right? There doesn't get blown out by any certain type of deck. You know, it doesn't get blown out by stuff like Deep Barrier either. The stuff that blows out Fire King Snake Eyes is like it's like some hand traps, you know, like Maxi, Shifter, and Droll. Those are the things that blow out Fire King Snake Eyes, or that hurt Fire King Snake Eyes the most. Not actual decks, just a few individual cards, which admittedly being weak to Maxi is not ideal. You know, that is one of the weaknesses. If this deck does have a weakness, that is one of them. Also, the Shifter, although Shifter is thankfully limited now, so you're gonna get Shifter a lot less, but that's still something to keep in mind. And then there's Droll, which I don't know how common Droll is going to be. It's definitely not as common as Maxi, but if Droll picks up popularity, then this deck will be hurt by it more than than most. It's like definitely Droll is going to hurt this deck more than the Labyrinth deck that I just showed you before this. And another problem with this deck is that I did say that the ban list didn't hurt this deck nearly enough, but this deck does have inconsistency problems, admittedly. This deck runs a lot of suboptimal draws now, because Poplar is drawing Poplar is not ideal, especially if you open Ash. If you play Oak, obviously Oak is not a starter as well. Ponix itself is like a very bunked starter. Like, it's actually not full combo by itself. You have to get lucky off of the Zombie Vampire when you start with Ponix. So yeah, this top row of level 1 monsters are actually not really ideal draws. Also, because you're running Alcanix, you run stuff like Garunix, which obviously this is a card that doesn't do much. Flamber's also another card that doesn't do much. Kieran's, well, they're very nice to draw, they're also not starters. So like this entire row down, this entire like row of like 5 monsters down here also don't help you play the game. And obviously, drawing original Symbol Spoils as your only search target off of Poplar and Buy a Bellstar is not because you don't run Temple. You can run Temple, but a lot of builds are choosing to cut Temple. And if you cut Temple, then you have no secondary search target if you draw into the Symbol Spoils. So yeah, there's just a lot of cards you tend not to want to draw. Like also like drawing Fire King Sacred. It's okay because you can just search the Skyburn afterwards, but yeah, there's sometimes you can, also the Arvada. The Arvada takes up a normal summon. It's usually not what you want to normal summon in this deck. And overall, this deck has around like 13-ish, 14, maybe if you squint, but realistically just 13 starters. And by starters, I'm also including stuff like Ponix, which is not even really ideal. So yeah, sometimes this deck has consistency problems. I'm not going to pretend that this deck doesn't draw bad hands and that the ban list did nothing, but yeah, that's something to keep in mind. And then this deck also could do with more non-engine. I'm not gonna lie, this deck currently, this build has 13 hand traps, which is only average at best by 2024 standards. So yeah, and it's only at 13 because of all the engine requirements that you do have to play. So the deck building for this deck can feel a little rough, and the hands that you sometimes draw are... There's a wide range of hand quality that this deck can have. So as for the decks with good matchups against Fire King Snake Eyes, I didn't mention how Fire King Snake Eyes has no bad matchups that can really exploit it that badly. I will say that there is one kind of deck that you might have a better chance with against Fire King Snake Eyes than most, and those are the spell heavy decks. Not necessarily the ones that run board breakers, although they do tend to run board breakers, and especially out of all board breakers, Talons is probably the one that can sometimes be the most effective, because you can just take stuff like Appaloosa and take stuff like IP, which makes the board more manageable. But decks that have engines based on spells, like stuff like Branded, with Brand Fusion stuff, I know like this isn't a very common deck, but Endymion, if Endymion gets going and they get their spell counters and they activate their spell cards, then the Fire King Snake Eyes doesn't have a real good way to interact with spell cards per se. And stuff like Striker specifically, if it runs Soul Release and Thrust, can have a pretty decent matchup against Fire King Snake Eyes. Admittedly, that's a very niche type of thing, and I know the Striker with Soul Release is not the most common, and I don't know if it's justified to run Soul Release even with Fire King Snake Eyes only being the third most played deck, but definitely that just Techian Thrust Soul Release Sky Striker is a way to is one of the targeted ways to deal with Fire King Snake Eyes. But yeah, mainly the point I'm getting through is that most decks Fire King Snake Eyes will do decently well, or if not good against anyway. So it's hard to find a good matchup to exploit Fire King Snake Eyes with. But yeah, now onto the second most played deck, which surprised me. So according to the data, which again is all ranked games that took place in Diamond and Master ranked, the second most played deck this season so far was Centurion, which to me is baffling, since I'm not the biggest fan of this deck, at least when it comes to being among the best decks in the game, but you know, I will try to keep my personal biases aside when evaluating this deck. And I know some people might also suggest that, well, White Forest just came out, so surely a lot of the numbers are being boosted by White Forest usage. And yes, there is some White Forest usage in the Centurion data. There's also other hybrids, which, you know, I'm well aware of hybrid builds using Centurion that, you know, some like Super Heavy Samurai, but for the most part, the majority of the Centurion builds are pure or just pure with like a few Bestials, which is mainly what I'm going to be looking at for this video. And obviously, when you're thinking of Centurion, the number one thing you think of when you hear Centurion is just the non-engine room, and specifically the amount of room for hand traps. Like, look at this build in particular. You have 3 Valor, 3 Maxi, so 3, 3, 3, 12, 15, and if you count the Bestials, which oftentimes, I'll get to later, but if you count the Bestials as hand traps, you have room for up to 18 plus hand traps. And you could even run more if you really wanted to. That's an insane amount of hand traps. So, and obviously hand traps will always be good in Master Duel. So yeah, that's one huge advantage of playing Centurion. And then, you know, another thing with Centurion is that if you can get into a grind game, which again, running this many hand traps, 18 hand traps, you tend to be able to slow the game down to where you can get to a grind game. You don't have to OTK your opponent, but if you go into a game that lasts, a prolonged game that lasts multiple like turns, like 3, 4, 5 plus turns, you have the advantage because you have a very strong grind game, being able to just summon back your Centurion monsters from your spell and trap zone every turn, and then getting a surge off Primera every turn, getting follow up every turn, you know, getting something back your Centurion level 12 synchros with stuff like Phalanx, you know, getting additional value every turn to Gargoyle, getting back to your hand, Tridea playing itself back into the spell and trap zone and getting a free summon every turn. Like, this deck is excellent in the grind game. And then on top of that, you have the grind game of the Centurions plus the grind game of the Bestials, which Branded Regain is one of the strongest grind cards in the entire game, you know, getting a +2 every turn from the draw and from the summon, and then summoning back a Magnum, which gets you another search. So yeah, you're getting like +3, +4, 5 plus cards every turn. As if you can like slow down the game to like a slower pace, you're definitely going to be in the advantage there. And then Bestials. So when Bestials are good, Centurion is one of the decks that gets buffed the greatest from Bestials being good, because this is a deck that naturally will play Bestials for its engine anyways. And yeah, with the introduction of decks like Gimmick, from the new pack specifically, decks like Gimmick Puppet, decks like White Forest, as mentioned, decks like the increased popularity of Illusion, and Illusion has plenty of targets for Bestials. There have been an influx of decks where Bestials have been good against, and then obviously that's good for Centurion. Now, some of the downsides of Centurion, and there definitely are a few. One of them is that, number one, this deck has a low-ish amount of starters. So they banned Prosperity, so as you can see now, you have 3 Primera, 3 Tridea, 3 Stand Up, and then 3 Emblem O. And these are pretty much your only ways into your Centurion engine. And that's 12 starters, which is 12 starters is very low by 2024 standards. There are plenty of games where you will simply not open any way to your Centurion engine, or your one Centurion play will get hit by a hand trap, and then you have to rely on doing bestial control the rest of the way. You know, sometimes that involves turning your Primera into an Artemis, and then using your bestial to banish your Primera for summoning your bestial so that you can get the Libellion, and then going into an SP to banish another card from your grave so that you can draw a card, and then you're playing SP bestial control. Yeah, obviously that's fine, you know, that's okay, but it's not ideal. And then obviously the ability to play through interruptions. When you only have 12-ish starters and you need to draw multiple of your 12 starters to be able to play through interruptions, and specifically like if you have a Primera plus Stand Up, for example, that's fine. That can play through an Ash or Primera. But if you have Primera plus Trudea, that does not help you at all in playing through hand traps. So yeah, you need like specific combinations of your starters to be able to play their hand traps. And if your opponent holds like an infirm for your Auxilia, holding an infirm for your Auxilia, and if people know that that's how you're supposed to hand trap Centurion, that's rough, because then you lose both your search for Phalanx and you lose your ability to set Chimera in your back row, so that you lose your ability to go into Synchro on your opponent's turn, and specifically going into Crimson Dragon into Blazar as well. So like one infirm can cut off 2 interruptions for you right there. So playing through multiple hand traps, especially given how one of the most popular decks plays a ton of hand traps, can be rough. So a lot of times you're gonna be playing Bistio and you're gonna be playing hand trap control, but you're not gonna be able to access much of your Centurion engine. And finally, to circle back to that point on Bistios, obviously when Bistios are better in a format, it helps Centurion, but when Bistios aren't as great, Centurion does lose a bit of his power. So as I mentioned before, there have been a few decks introduced from the new pack that Bistios are good against. Some of the best decks, however, in this format, it's the opposite way. As even the decks I've shown already, against the Fire King Snake Eyes right before this, Bistios are not exactly too great against it. And against a deck that you'll probably see coming up very shortly, Tenpai, Bistios are horrid against that deck. So when 2 of like the top 5 decks don't care about Bistios at all, and then you could also throw Centurion in that mix as well. Centurion is also a deck that does not really care about Bistios, because Auxilia can simply replace your Centurion monsters from the banish, so that Bistios honestly don't really do much at all to your deck. When 3 of the top 5 most played decks don't care about Bistios, that's not like a fantastic position to be in a deck that relies on Bistios that much. But so basically, the good decks that counter Centurion, or decks that are good against Centurion, you don't really have to be that special. Like, you don't have to counter Centurion in order to beat this deck. It's not a super high power deck. I would, on a tier list, for example, I would consider this deck a tier below all of the other, or like half a tier to like a full tier below all the other decks that I mentioned already. But yeah, obviously, again, decks that aren't hurt by Bistios, I've mentioned Fire King Snake Eyes and Tenpai, but also another high level deck, another very strong deck this format, something like Ritual Beast, which also does not care too much about Bistios, also can and also does not care about a lot of hand traps in particular, can steamroll Centurion, even especially if it goes first. And then obviously there's another thing is back row decks that I mentioned that don't care too much about hand traps, like the Labyrinth deck I showed, especially the trap heavy Labyrinth build, and also stuff like Dinomorphia or True Draco. They really do not care that much about Maxi, Imperm, Ghost Ogre, Valor, and like Ash is often the only one of your non-engine that's actually good against those decks. So yeah, you end up playing like those decks tend to make you just brick on a lot of the non-engine that you play in your deck. So yeah, that's Centurion. Again, I'm not sure if it's deserving of its second most played status, but it's definitely a deck that you will probably run into because of that. So yeah, now on to the next one, which I'm sure everyone will be completely shocked about. So finally, big shocker. I'm sure no one saw this coming. Urge Chandra. The number 1 most played deck in Master Duel is Tenpai. And really, just to highlight how much Tenpai is played, Tenpai is being played at around like a 20-ish, 21, 22-ish % play rate on Master Duel. That is 3 times as much as the second most played deck. Tenpai is being played more so than the other 4 decks. Tenpai is being played as much as the other 4 decks in this top 5 most played deck list combined. So that gives you like a perspective. Just everyone from like every 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 games you play on Master Duel ladder will be versus Tenpai. So if anything, learn to play against this deck at the very least, or play this deck yourself. But then you have to learn to play the mirror match, which we'll get to later. But yeah, Tenpai. Because this deck has been spammed nonstop for the better part of like 2 months now, 1.5 months now, whenever this came out. I'm sure a lot of people are already very familiar with how the deck works and what the deck does, so I'm really not going to go into much detail about the intricacies of how to do the Tenpai combos. I'm sure you know Chandra, Transcendence, Sangan Summoning, all that stuff. But yeah, so obviously an advantage of playing Tenpai is that look at all this non-engine space. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9, 19 hand traps plus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 board breakers. So do the math, that's 25 non-engine, 25 non-engine, and 15 starters. 25 non-engine, that's insane. 25 non-engine. You're on average going to open 2 to 3 minimum of these non-engine cards against your opponent every single game. So yeah, that's imagine forcing your opponent to play through 2 to 3 hand traps, or like 2 to hand traps plus Forbidden Droplets, or plus Lightning Storm, plus Harvey Feather Duster, plus Bestial Magnum, plus L plus ratio, right? Like yeah, the annoying thing is if you stop your opponent with 4 cards in your hand as a Tenpai player, and then your last card is literally any 1-card starter, which is basically any card that's not Fadra, any dragon that's not Fadra, you win the game. Your opponent's dead. So yeah, that's the advantage of playing Tenpai. And also, Sangan Summoning plus Transcendent Dragon, these cards are some of the most ignorant cards that's ever been printed. Unless you're playing against a fan of Yubel, your opponent cannot interact with you. So yeah, that's fantastic. I don't need to muse over like how good your opponent not being able to interact with you at all is, and how easy that makes OTKs. And yeah, obviously another thing is that this deck wins the coin flip more often than every other deck. Unless you're playing the mirror match, you're winning every single coin flip. So you're gonna go first about 75 to 80% of the time. Whereas most decks only win the coin flip 50% of the time, or I guess with Tenpai's existence, you can boost it up to like 55 to 60% of the time. But Tenpai, you win the coin flip 80% of the time going second. So surprisingly, there's less RNG involved with playing Tenpai, since when you're going second, you don't care about as much as getting hit by Max E, because who cares about Max E when you're just going to kill your opponent, right? And who cares about playing into Nibiru when you're doing all your summons in the battlefield, right? There's surprisingly less RNG involved in playing Tenpai than there is in other decks, because just because you can control the fact that you can control for going second more often, and the fact that you have so much more room for non-engine than every other deck, that you're more than likely, just mathematically, more likely to open combinations of these. So yeah, that's Tenpai. That's why Tenpai is so good. That's why everyone loves to play Tenpai. But there are some flaws with this deck. This deck is not perfect. And one of the things that has to do with the power level of Master Duel, there are so many decks in Master Duel that are so ignorant and more degenerate than even Tenpai is, that if you make them go first, it's never a good thing. There are a multitude of FTK decks now in Master Duel, especially with the new pack. We have Gimmick Puppet, which is an FTK deck that literally has cards that are printed to ignore interaction, much like the Tenpai cards are, except they're in a go first deck and not a go second deck, so their goal is to FTK you. So yeah, sometimes you're gonna make an FTK deck go first playing Tenpai, which is not ideal. Sometimes you're gonna play against unfair combo decks. The multitude of pendulum slops or like just heavy combo decks that scale Wakaushi and then end on like 3-4 plus Omni Negates and whatever. Tenpai's good at going second, but Tenpai's not going to be able to play through a board like that. And also, heavy back row decks. Again, a theme with decks with a lot of hand traps is that if you just play a back row deck that sets 5, that renders all of your hand traps useless. So the only effective non-engine you have now are these Duster and Lightning Storms against the Floodgates. And chances are those decks that set 5, they're going to have their own Solemns, they're going to have their own ways to deal with Lightning Storm or Duster, or you're going to run something like an anti-spell fragments like the Labyrinth deck. And then if these cards don't go through, then you're in a bad spot, because then you're going to probably get Floodgated out of the game with a bunch of dead hand drops in hand. So yeah, that is the thing. And then everyone is building to counter Tenpai. Everyone knows this matchup by now, okay? So Like everyone is prepared to play against Senpai. Even decks that aren't like dedicated going first decks like Voice Sway, they're playing Floodgates in the main. They're playing Solemn Judgment in the main. Decks are playing greedier combos. They're going for higher end combos. You know, Yubel again. Sometimes Yubel is playing Scythe just for Tenpai. Like decks, people are getting really degen with their turn 1 boards now because of Tenpai existing. So, yeah, you're gonna face a lot of very strong boards going second as Tenpai. And lastly, the mirror match. No one likes playing the Tenpai mirror match except for true Tenpai players. Like I personally, the mirror match is like the one time where you can't lose the coin flip, and then because there's so much non-engine flying around between you and your opponent, a lot of the mirror matches you play versus Tenpai seem like they're just extremely hand dependent depending on who drew more live non-engine from their opponent and who won the coin flip and made their opponent go first. Oh yeah, don't play this deck if you don't want to be playing a lot of mirror matches, because you're going to have to learn to play the mirror match if you play this deck. So that's one thing for sure. So again, the decks that are good against Tenpai, FTK decks that are just the super greedy combo decks that end on everything going first, the heavy backrow decks that don't care as much about the hand traps, and as another type of deck is like the Fire King Snake Eyes deck, the decks with very layered interruption. You know, interruption from the grave and the hand, like in the Fire King Snake Eyes in terms of like their Promethean Princesses or their Mascarenas or their Ambler Whales and Grave. Another deck like that is what's it called? It's Tearlaments. Tearlaments have quite a few interruptions in Grave too, such as Snow and the Shufflers. And then if you droplet them, sometimes they can simply, fuse again, whether it be their back row, whether like their Meta Noise or their Sulliak, or you trigger a Scream, they mill a Tear Name, they get the fuse again, and then they just get to make another fusion after you droplet them. So layered, the decks that are strong going first, that may either make an unbreakable board FTK or make a board with multiple layered interactions. Those are the decks that are really hard for Tenpai to play through because you're just relying on non-engine, and a lot of times just one or even two board breakers aren't enough to break through those boards. But yeah, Chandra. So those are the decks that you should probably expect to see the most during your Duelist cut line. And whether your goal is to grind deep into stage 2 or just get all the gems from stage 1, I hope you achieve your goal without too much rage going on. And let me know if you have any questions regarding these decks or just anything for that matter. Just drop a question. I'll do my best to answer them.